Welcome to TrialSite News Podcast Series. The subject for today is the Pathophysiologic Rationale for Early Ambulatory Treatment for COVID-19 as an emergency response to the pandemic. To discuss this with us, we are delighted to have Dr. Peter McCullough, Vice Chairman, Internal Medicine, Baylor University, Dallas, Texas. Now, Dr. McCullough is board certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine in Internal Medicine and Cardiovascular Disease. He has a master's in public health and epidemiology. Dr. McCullough is an internationally recognized authority on the evaluation of medical evidence concerning contemporary issues in medicine and has published widely with over 1,000 publications and 500 citations in the National Library of Medicine. He has been a leader in the medical response to the COVID-19 disaster and has published the first guidance for the medical treatment of ambulatory patients infected with SARS-CoV-2. And lastly, he has published a widely read op-ed series on COVID-19 in TheHill. So, Dr. McCullough, we want to thank you for taking the time to participate in the TrialSite News podcast show.
Well, thanks for having me.
The pleasure is ours. Now, I'm going to jump right into this. Here in the United States alone, we have over 220,000 COVID-related deaths. However, we are learning a lot on multiple fronts about this disease. And we know that you have been outspoken about pragmatic approaches to save lives, and we are grateful to you for that. Back in June, you put together a collaborative with American and Italian researchers, which led to the publishing of a paper titled Pathophysiological Basis and Rationale for Early Outpatient Treatment of SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 Infection. And we want to talk to you about this question. So before we get into the heart of that work, can you share with us why you think the virus is spreading so fast in the United States, while in other countries it appears to be more contained?
Well, I'm not an expert on contagion control, and I recognize that all countries have taken different approaches, but I think we'd all agree that contagion control as a principal strategy, that is to try to reduce the spread of the virus, it simply hasn't worked. And in my view, there's four pillars to pandemic response. One is contagion control. The second one is early treatment to reduce hospitalization and death. The third is treatments in the hospital in order to save lives. And then the fourth would be vaccination. So in my view, in many countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, United Kingdom come to mind, there's been a very large focus on contagion control. Matter of fact, almost all the messaging in the media and through government agencies has been on contagion control. And then there's been a little bit on late hospital treatments and vaccination. But there's been basically an oblivion or a complete missing segment of pandemic response, and that's early treatment.
Now, let's move on to the paper then. Now, this was published in the American Journal of Medicine in August. And we know it is the first published peer-reviewed treatment guidance for practitioners who are caring for ambulatory patients for COVID-19. Is this correct?
That's true. We assembled a group of experts starting in May and June, and we saw a great need to come up with an approach, if you will, to the early treatment of the infection in patients who were falling ill at home. And we were up to 50,000 peer-reviewed publications in the literature with a lot of information about the virus and what it does to the body and the pathobiologic approaches. We reviewed summaries of what empiric approaches were taken in the hospital. But what we found is there was a complete lack of assembly of the key concepts in order for a doctor or another care provider to take care of a patient at home. It was a complete blank spot in the literature.
Now, based on a recent talk that you presented this information to, what you referred to as the second front line, the ambulatory-based doctors and advanced physician practitioners that are caring for COVID-19 patients on a daily basis, can you share more with the audience who the second line is, why are they so instrumental in combating this virus, and how they've received the paper's recommendations?
Well, early on in the pandemic, we heard a lot about what's called the front line, or doctors and nurses in the hospital who really were putting themselves personally and professionally at risk, taking care of acutely ill COVID patients. And in fact, there were more mortalities among healthcare workers in the hospital, very similar to deaths that would occur in battle, if you will. And these weren't conscripted professionals. These were people showing up to work every day voluntarily, feeling that that was their job to take care of sick patients. That's what the public got to know as the front line. But what became clear was that there was a second front line, and that was the front line of all the doctors and nurses and clinics and urgent care centers, not so dramatic as the hospital, but they were receiving literally millions of calls and visits from patients falling ill with COVID-19, and with the question of what should we do? And that second front line has had no guidance at all from any federal or national agency, no guidance from community health agencies. In fact, the agencies have simply said, when you get COVID, call your doctor. And the doctors were basically given no sets of instructions beyond that. That group became the second front line, and they were quite divergent. Independent doctors who really felt the call to duty, if you will, started innovating and coming up with strategies based on what was published in the literature and based on their experience. Others, particularly those who were employed in large health systems and academic medical centers, really kept the current party line from the National Institutes of Health and the FDA, and that is to provide no treatment. And so this kind of division between the academic medical centers and the big employed health systems, which were in line with the government approach of no treatment versus the rebel doctors, if you will, on the second front line.
Now, your recommendations were the first peer-reviewed published algorithm for an outpatient physician or advanced practitioner to manage COVID-19 outpatient or COVID-19 in the outpatient realm, which of course includes home-based care. The first published set of recommendations, again, rising out of critical need to provide an emergency approach to care for some patients diagnosed with COVID-19 or with COVID-19 symptoms. Can you break this down, or can you break this algorithm down for the audience?
Sure, I'll walk you through it. So our international group of experts from Italy and the United States across internal medicine, critical care, medical subspecialties, and safety areas in ophthalmology and electrophysiology surveyed the literature, and we synthesized really the salient available literature from clinical trials, observational and preclinical studies on what would be a reasonable approach, what would have a reasonable chance of success with an accepted safety profile. And our analysis of the literature, and it is the same today, is that there are no definitive trials. There are no conclusive studies. There really is no proof that anything really works in COVID-19. And that's because the clinical trials have not been done. We have not been presented with clinical trials of sample sizes of 20 or 40 or 60,000 individuals. That's what we're really going to need to understand efficacy and safety. We're only going to have definitive trials for the vaccines. Only the vaccines have the scientific robustness to give doctors proof that something works. So we're really down to what we consider a reasonable probability of success, not proven efficacy. And it's been said that medicine is both an art and a science. Much of what you're going to see today is really the art of medicine and clinical judgment. And we felt that we had the purview to do that. We had experts assembled from the best centers in the United States and Italy. Authors on this paper together have thousands of peer-reviewed publications and are editors of major journals and are considered the premier doctors in the world today. So let me walk through this. The first algorithm was published in the American Journal of Medicine in August 7th of 2020. The version that you see has been updated in the proceedings of the Baylor University Medical Center. I did this as a sole author because it had to be critically updated. And it goes as follows. Individuals who develop COVID-19 illness, whether or not they're confirmed by a test, whether it be an antigen test or a PCR test, if they clinically have the syndrome with the cardinal features, age under 50, no comorbidities, our recommendations are no treatment. So our recommendations are in line with the National Institutes of Health and other guidances that recommend just simply waiting out a quarantine period and then expecting recovery. Because it is true, under age 50, the mortality rate in all published studies is far less than 1%. We don't think that treatment could influence that a risk very much at all. Now, if it's under age 50 with a medical problem or over age 50, with or without medical problems, and they include obesity, diabetes, heart or lung disease, present or past cancer, renal disease, that treatment should be undertaken. And the first line of treatment would be forms of over-the-counter vitamins and supplements that would be reasonable support. Some of them have very weak supportive data from observational studies. Some have randomized trial data, but they include zinc sulfate, 220 milligrams, which has 50 milligrams of elemental zinc, vitamin D3, 5,000 international units, and not shown here, but also now in that grouping is vitamin C at 3,000 milligrams a day. Okay, so that's really a base. After that, it's moving on to at least 2 what we call off-target antiviral treatments. The lead compound is hydroxychloroquine. That's been the most studied drug in treating COVID-19 worldwide. There have been more patients treated with hydroxychloroquine far as a therapy for COVID-19 than any other treatment in the world. It is featured in outpatient treatment guidelines in many countries outside the United States. Hydroxychloroquine, 200 milligrams twice a day, that works on reducing viral endosomal replication. And added to that, an antibiotic that has mild antiviral activities, but also could treat bacterial secondary infection. That's azithromycin or doxycycline. So hydroxy plus azithro or doxycycline as one option. Another option is ivermectin. Ivermectin is a broad spectrum anti-parasitic drug that reduces the entry of the virus into the nucleus of the cells, has much less supportive data than hydroxychloroquine, but it'd be ivermectin again with one of those 2 antibiotics. And then outside the United States, there is an oral antiviral drug approved for use in COVID-19, and that's called favipiravir. That drug is not approved for use or even proposed for use in the United States. Favipiravir is an oral RNA-dependent polymerase inhibitor with the same mechanism of action as remdesivir, but it's available orally, again, plus one of those antibiotics. Now, if any respiratory symptoms develops or we get to day 5 of illness and patients still feel ill, the recommendations are to move on with corticosteroids. The most familiar oral steroid used worldwide is prednisone, 1 milligram per kilogram, typically about 60 milligrams in an average individual for 5 days with or without a taper. We know from the inpatient trial called the recovery trial in the UK that dexamethasone, glucocorticoid, 6 milligrams a day, had benefit compared to usual care, but it wasn't placebo controlled. There was no drug accountability done in that study. And we do know that with dexamethasone, even in the treated group, the mortality was 22.9%, unacceptably high. So our experts felt that a more balanced and proven steroid, prednisone, would be prudent in that treatment of this middle phase of COVID-19 called cytokine storm. And then the last phase of COVID-19 really is microthrombosis or pathologic macrothrombosis. And there are some forms of blood thinners or anticoagulants are needed. We recommend now aspirin 325 milligrams for people over age 50 in this group all the way throughout the illness because we know there's a hyperactivation of thromboxane E2 and platelet aggregation. And then in patients at higher risk, including heart or lung disease, thromboembolic risk, to actually use a medicinal blood thinner or anticoagulant, and that would be injectable low molecular weight heparins or oral novel anticoagulants. Now, people have asked, how long do we treat? I think the shortest duration of time that I'm aware of in published studies is 5 days. The maximum is 30 days. And so it'll settle out for each patient, but we'd like to have patients nearly asymptomatic before we finish this sequential early multi-drug treatment approach. Now, if patients are over age 50, multiple comorbidities, we recommend the full package, and then supplemental oxygen and pulse oximetry if needed. And we advise on telemedicine and careful monitoring nearly on a daily basis. And this is important because when oxygen saturation begins to fall off, patients can precipitously decline, and the doctors and the patients need to use their judgment on when to resort to hospitalization. But we believe that this early treatment protocol, based on a reasonable chance of success, based on principles we know now have been published with respect to COVID-19 infection, and those principles are used in the hospital anyway, that if they're used early on, that they have a reasonable chance of success in reducing COVID-19 hospitalizations and death.
Now, I want to ask you about two things: monoclonal antibodies and convalescent plasma. Let's start with monoclonal antibodies first. There's a lot of public money going into advanced monoclonal antibody research and development and clinical trials right now targeting COVID-19. What are your thoughts on the ambulatory and outpatient trial for more advanced monoclonal antibodies, such as the ones taken by President Trump here in the States, Regeneron's or Regen-CoV-2, for example? Do these have a place in the short, intermediate, or in the more long-run treatment option?
Well, if we think about the illness as a first phase of viral replication, a second phase of cytokine storm, and a third phase of microthrombosis, antibodies that are directed against the virus, like President Trump received, they would be in that early antiviral phase. So again, 2 or more antivirals. President Trump received the antibodies, terrific. He received remdesivir. So he received 2 antiviral treatments. We would advise for outpatients with the oral medications that we're advising also 2 antiviral treatments. He received 2 state-of-the-art treatments that involved intravenous infusions. He did take on safety risks, and I think that's fair to point out. Remdesivir has a clear safety concern regarding liver toxicity, and then the antibodies have a safety concern of actually precipitating a serious immune reaction called anaphylaxis. So he took on risks, but I understand the approach of 2 antivirals up front.
Now, convalescent plasma. What about the acceptance of the use of convalescent plasma via the Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA? Any thoughts on this FDA decision?
Convalescent plasma is trying to achieve what the designer antibodies are, at least the antibodies that are directed against the virus, in that if there are enough people that have had enough exposure to the virus, it's hoped that they have raised antibodies against it, and it can be used early in the antiviral phase. So the Mayo Clinic undertook a large non-randomized study which showed a signal of benefit, and then randomized trials were undertaken. The difficulty there is we can never know if the donors who have contributed the antibodies, if those antibodies have true neutralizing effect in the next acutely ill patient. And it involves pooling, obviously, of blood samples from a variety of individuals. But I think the data in aggregate suggest benefit. So when the FDA gave an emergency use authorization, which in a sense liberalizes hospitals to administer that, I thought based on an emergency basis that was appropriate. The National Institutes of Health 2 days later promptly issued a warning stating that convalescent plasma should not be used in the acute treatment of COVID-19. So that's where I think there's been mistakes. We cannot have 2 major government agencies, the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, within 48 hours of each other, completely contradicting one another. That's counterproductive. And I think the agencies ought to be much more coordinated and give a much more consistent message to health systems. So doctors and health systems, they want to take care of patients, and they don't want to see our government agencies completely disagreeing with one another.
Right. Not to mention the confusion, and which then can cause fear from the public. So let's move on to the next topic there. It's a little more philosophical to some extent and could raise some uncomfortable topics. We here at TrialSite News have been noticing an increasing divide between the research, regulatory, and government agencies, like the FDA and NIH, which you just mentioned, and perhaps elements of the pharmaceutical industry and academic medical centers on the one hand, and health systems, hospitals, and regional health centers on the other hand. There seems to be a widening divide out there between research and care, yet there has been a growing movement for the research as a care option supported by many in government and industry. Has this divide always been here for a while? And is it perhaps that the pandemic is simply triggering what is a growing tension, or are we seeing new divisions open up between research and clinicians?
I think there are new divisions because we're in the middle of an emergency pandemic. Keep in mind that almost all of our collaborations between academia, practice, and government agencies are in the setting of chronic diseases. So we have plenty of time to work our way through heart disease and cancer and other illnesses. And suddenly now we have this medical problem, which is an acute emergency, and we are just not designed to respond in a sufficient fashion to an acute emergency. And I think everybody is trying their best to put their best foot forward. But I have to tell you, doctors who are receiving calls from patients, of which I literally before this interview was fielding calls for patients, doctors really feel responsible. We feel like we're on the hook right now. We do have the fiduciary responsibility to patients. We have a medical legal responsibility to patients. And we know that patients are contracting a potentially fatal disease. And every patient who gets COVID-19 now, they understand this is potentially fatal. This is the first time in our careers that this has happened. There's no playbook in how to respond. And I think in many ways, we need to have a much more dialogue and much more coordination than opposed to the different groups crawling into their silos. We need much more international collaboration. Believe me, this is a worldwide pandemic. I turn on the news every night. I've still yet to see a best practices segment about how countries are handling the epidemic from a treatment perspective. We hear a lot about contagion control, but honestly, I think there's fatigue on this. People can't hear another segment about wearing masks or washing their hands. What people want to hear about is what are the advances in treatment and what's a rational approach when COVID-19 is contracted.
Well, and to your point, part of the problem is because the division of what is and isn't acceptable, that may contribute to why we're seeing less of that. I mean, a great example of this would be hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And although there seems to be some mounting evidence to consider public funding of research, they just appear to not have the interest of much of the research establishment. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Well, I published an opinion editorial this summer, and it was titled "The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine Development Approach." And what occurred in our country, remember I said there's 4 pillars to pandemic response: contagion control, early treatment, hospitalization, and vaccines. On that second pillar of early treatment, the United States and Canada and Australia, UK, you can kind of go down the line, Western Europe, they gambled. And the gamble was to basically not look at early treatment and make no investment in early treatment. There has been no substantial government study of early treatment whatsoever. And if we would have started early, we could have had a 20,000 patient trial, 40,000 patient trial. We'd have a lot of evidence. There's been really, it was in many ways, well, historians will look back on that and say that was a strategic blunder. It was a global blunder not to invest in early treatment with so many people falling ill. The strategy was to work on contagion control, keep the message on contagion control, and keep the population reasonably assured that a vaccine will come in a sense, save the world from COVID-19. That's been the strategy. And in my op-ed, I indicate that, as you can tell from my comments, I think that's an enormous gamble. The last time a vaccine saved the world was polio in 1964. We're starting to get signals now that the vaccines are delayed. Some of the development programs have delayed. They are massive programs. We're talking about one of the programs has 46,000 patients in it. And these trials do have stopping rules for stopping early for overwhelming benefit. They have data safety monitoring boards. And so every day and every week and every month that goes by with no news on the vaccine, I think the prospects dim for a vaccine to be saving the world. And looking back now, we should have developed an early treatment programs from the very beginning. Other countries did. India, Bangladesh, Greece, Russia, Japan, they all invested with early treatment. They weren't going to gamble on a vaccine. If a vaccine comes in, great. But right now, we need to save patients from being hospitalized and dying. And in the United States, we've made zero attempt to reduce hospitalizations in our country, none. In fact, the guidelines from the National Institutes of Health on October 9th, 2020, simply state to ride it out until the point of requiring hospitalization. And even if one gets hospitalized, that treatment should not start until a patient is so sick they need oxygen. We know at that level, the mortality rate is 12.9%. We know in the United States, if an individual with COVID-19 needs the ICU, the mortality rate is 22 to 34%. And in my view, That is too risky. That is too risky for a government to advise patients should stay at home and get progressively ill with no treatment and face those mortality risks before we even start the very first administration of therapy. I think it's it's an extraordinarily risky approach. I think historians will be unkind to the individuals who crafted that approach, and there are many involved in our leadership. And I think individuals like myself will look back on this and I think very clearly state the failure to institute large-scale clinical trials at the beginning of the pandemic for outpatient treatment was a colossal blunder on behalf of the White House Task Force, the National Institutes of Health, and supportive agencies like the FDA. It was a colossal blunder. The same has been made in Canada, the UK, Western Europe, Australia, and some South American countries. And I think this will go down in history as one of the most catastrophic strategic decisions in emergency response that costed human life beyond all imagine.
Yeah, and you could see the slow walking happening. We've spoken with a plethora of doctors over the last number of months who have been trying to get treatment, and they're blocked at every turn, it seems.
Well, one response to this and one suggestion that I have to leaders in Washington is that one way to handle a blunder is to continue to make the mistake, even kind of double down and say, again, we advise on no treatment, which is currently the stance by the FDA and NIH. Another way to do it is just simply to soften and say, we recognize things are getting worse now, hospitalizations are going up, more people are falling ill, and that we're going to change our guidance and simply encourage patients to contact their doctors, and we're going to support the doctors in their best judgment of available medications to reduce symptoms and with the hope of reducing hospitalizations and death. I think we could take some softer language that would give the green light to large health systems and academic medical centers to do the best they can. Right now, they feel completely handcuffed by the NIH and the FDA in not offering any treatment. And it's even worse in Canada. It's worse in Australia, where treatment is really expressively prohibited. So whatever's going on is not just uniquely United States. It can't be political. There's something going on in certain countries in the world, which many view is not only blunderous, but it's almost intentionally injurious.
Yeah. So you touched on the NIH, and so I want to shift over to them. Now, this organization is funded with taxpayer dollars. Given the growing evidence that Ivermectin, for example, seems to inhibit COVID-19, do you think that the NIH has an obligation, even perhaps a duty, to spend at least some money to sponsor research to find out more, given the amount of death that we are experiencing, as you've touched on here?
Yes, well, the NIH has a whole grouping of treatment trials called the ACTIVE program. They need to immediately have early outpatient treatments and have all the promising agents on the table: favipiravir, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. Stanford is currently doing a study with favipiravir. That needs to be supercharged. Duke University is doing a study with hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis. All of these need to be supercharged and move forward. I have to tell you, I think a lead organization in Canada for outpatient trials is the Montreal Heart Institute. They're leading a trial called Corona, and it's an outpatient randomized trial of colchicine versus placebo. But they clearly have established a North American infrastructure where patients call a hotline, they give the results, they go through the consent over the phone, and the study drug is shipped out to a patient's house within a matter of a couple hours. So in my view, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel here. If the Montreal Heart Institute and the Corona trial infrastructure is working and it's a nationwide program, we should tomorrow invest in a trial, you betcha, of early ivermectin plus a promising antibiotic like azithromycin or doxycycline. We should invest in other potential treatments. Favipiravir comes to mind. There may be others.
Yeah, and we reached out. Our founder, Daniel O'Connor, he reached out to the NIH director, Francis Collins, and suggesting that the NIH at least invest some money in ivermectin-based research. And not surprisingly, there was no response.
I think it'll go down in history as a blunder. I could be wrong. it may turn out that none of these treatments really work. And at this stage, we'll never know because the clinical trials are not there to either prove or disprove, and we'll continue to have this uncertainty with small, inconclusive trials and observational studies.
Right.
We'll never know. But I have to tell you, if a vaccine doesn't come in and save the world, boy, are we going to look back on this one and say, look at all the lost time. And we're going to look back and say, look what India did with hydroxychloroquine and favipiravir. Look what Bangladesh did with ivermectin. Keep in mind, the United States, in terms of COVID-19 deaths per million population, is nearly 800 deaths per million population. In Bangladesh and India and Greece, where they have early treatment government guidelines, that same statistic is less than 10% of our deaths per million population. So even though we have an older age structure, and a lot of these countries have a younger age structure, these differences in COVID mortality per million population is striking. And as we speak today, in some countries, when patients test positive, they're literally getting a take-home kit of early treatment. We know this is going on in at least 3 states in Brazil. We know this is going on in Salvador. It's going on in Goa, India. Patients actually get a little survival pack. They get ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, plus azithromycin or doxycycline, and some additional supportive drugs. They're at least doing something to, I think, settle down the population, relieve symptoms, and if these drugs even have a little bit of efficacy, take a reduction in the risk of hospitalization and death. I can tell you what's going on is every patient who contracts COVID-19, they know they potentially now have a fatal infection, particularly those older with medical conditions, and offering no therapy and having a hard line from a government perspective on this. I think this is a recipe for mass panic. And as we go into this deluge of cases this fall, the government has set up a lot of these first world countries for pure mass panic.
Yeah, which does nobody any good. So let's then shift gears again here. We have some questions from our audience, and if you have time, I'd like to have you answer some of them. Can you share with us what demographics and groups are at greatest risk for COVID-19 or with COVID-19?
Well, mortality goes up after age 50. Now, it's possible, someone in their 50s and 60s who are perfect health really wouldn't be at any excess risk for mortality. But I've been very impressed with how the obese do very poorly with COVID-19. Those with diabetes, heart or lung disease, kidney disease, those on dialysis, patients with prior cancer. There are certain ethnic groups that do very poorly. In the United States, it's African Americans and Hispanics. And then finally, I'd say probably the most vulnerable group, and my heart goes out to them, is the 1.4 million individuals who are in nursing homes or senior homes. Those individuals in many ways are sitting ducks. They can't really defend themselves against the virus. They contract it from infected workers who come into the facility. And there, the mortality rate has been astronomical in a nursing home and senior facilities. So, if you were to take the highest risk group, you'd say, listen, if any group to show any compassion from a government perspective is to have an early treatment approach for nursing homes and those in senior centers. But right now, the current advice is to do nothing for those individuals as well.
Which seems outrageous to me, especially seeing what happened in New York. The death toll there was catastrophic.
Yeah, you can imagine these nursing homes are under their state licenses. They have to respond to credentialing agencies. So they very much are at the mercy of government guidance. And if the government cannot give them the go-ahead coming from the National Institutes of Health, with support from the CDC and the FDA to go ahead and treat with off-target antivirals followed by corticosteroids and antithrombotics, and let that at least be a nursing home director to patient and family decision. If they can at least soften on that, it seems like it's almost cruel and unusual to let our seniors suffer with COVID-19 to the point of requiring oxygen and hospitalization. That just appears to be almost pure human torture at this stage.
It definitely needs to change. So next question there, and then here is, what about children? Why don't they get as sick as adults?
Well, the good news is there have never been any school outbreaks with in elementary schools or high schools or colleges. They don't seem to fall ill. We haven't had bundles of children hospitalized, and children are uniquely protected. The thought is that there's a key receptor that the virus uses called the ACE2 receptor. And children have many more of these receptors. So in theory, they could actually allow more viral entry, but it's probably not the issue. The ACE2 receptors actually fundamentally protect against the respiratory manifestations. So those who have more ACE2 receptors are basically protected from any serious illness, and that includes children. We know adults who take forms of drugs called ACE inhibitors have a relative protection as well. And that probably accounts for the striking age gradient in terms of mortality. And it is true that individuals under age 50, which is at least halfway through adult life, that under age 50 are largely protected from the risks of death. It can certainly cause an illness, which is uncomfortable, but they're largely protected. So our advice on treatment does not apply to children. It doesn't apply to younger adults. We're only advising treatment when the mortality begins to be in excess of 1%, and that starts at age 50. I can tell you at over age 80, mortality 15% and upwards.
Now, for the audience that wants to get active and activated to help promote and evangelize for your important protocol, are there any pragmatic things that they can do?
Yes, well, fortunately, I mentioned the rebel doctors. There's at least one a credentialed and recognized medical organization now, which is formally endorsing early treatment. And that organization is the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons. You can go to their website. They are very active in Washington. They have hosted a whole series of seminars, government interactions. They even have a patient guide on early home treatment for COVID-19. So I think the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons is, in a sense, the best organizational place to go in order to drive this forward. I mentioned the rebel doctors kind of in a casual way, but there are other organizations that are formed called American Frontline Doctors. And they all these groups have been in communication with each other through WebExes throughout the pandemic. But the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons, in a sense, they're keeping the list of the doctors who treat COVID-19, a list of the protocols, the resources, the patient guide. And I think the AAPS will really be the go-to organization. We knew there had to be one organization that had to break rank with the NIH and FDA. The American Medical Association hasn't done it. American College of Physicians, none of the specialty organizations have done it, but AAPS has done it, and I anticipate others will follow.
Now, finally, what are your thoughts on the prospect of a vaccine? We've been told by many prominent physicians and researchers that it'll be difficult to get a real working vaccine for a number of reasons. Many have brought up HIV as an example where billions and billions were spent on vaccine development and decades later, still no vaccine. Any thoughts on this topic?
Well, in my op-ed piece, The Great Gamble of the COVID-19 Vaccine, I predicted that a vaccine actually would come forward and be approved. I think it would be modestly effective, and the durability of the vaccine is going to be unknown. And so we know this much, that the original FDA guidance for 2 years of vaccine observational data has been now jettisoned, and we're down to FDA asking for 2 months of observation.
Oh, wow.
And at 2 months, we're talking about an administration, potentially a booster a month later. We may have in any given individual 2 or 3 months of assurance that, in fact, they haven't contracted COVID-19. We have no idea if that same person is going to be protected 5 or 6 months later, and that's even with an approved vaccine. Now, I think it'll be applied initially to those in senior homes, healthcare workers, and it'll move from there. But there's going to be great discussion. What happens if someone's already had COVID-19? Should they be vaccinated again? Will the vaccine cause what's called hyperactivation syndrome? Will it actually cause some of the manifestations of the infection to begin with, including cytokine storm or thrombosis? And then lastly, there's going to be concern about off-target safety events. 2 of the vaccine programs were halted because of safety events. These can be neurologic problems like Guillain-Barré syndrome or transverse myelitis, or things we haven't yet imagined. Like I say, we haven't had a vaccine save the world since polio in the 1960s, and that took 4 years, obviously a different time.
Right.
Many have thought that, gosh, in 9 months, we understand we've advanced a lot, but can we really pull this off with Operation Warp Speed? And I finished my piece by saying that, I understand the gusto of government agencies, the NIH, FDA, White House Task Force, in gunning for a vaccine. That took a lot of guts, took a lot of public-private partnership. We have government employees, by the way, who have patent positions and royalty rights to vaccines, just like we have companies inside the United States and outside the United States. So there's a lot of money and a lot of interest in this. But having said that, I think it's a gamble. And as doctors and a lot of our patients, we're not gamblers. And I think everyone's going to feel uncomfortable with that gamble. I would feel much more comfortable with oral treatments, drugs that I can prescribe, monitor, and try to understand if they work or not. And without that investment in the oral medications, I think we're set up with the proposition of face the gamble, take the gamble, and let's see what happens. And so we're going to have a look at what's the appetite of Americans, Canadians, Western Europeans, Australians, and some South Americans. These are the countries that are largely set up for this gamble. We're going to really understand what's our appetite for a giant human experiment. What's our appetite for a gamble where we have no idea what's going to come out on the other side? It's going to be quite an interesting proposition. That gamble, by the way, could come up in the next few weeks or months. It's hard to forecast, but I anticipate we will have an announcement on a vaccine, and all of us will look at the data with great anticipation.
Well, we're definitely watching history in the making for sure. Well, Dr. McCullough, we know your time is valuable. We are so grateful that you got to spend some time with us here at TrialSite News. And we want to thank you again for spending it with us.
Thanks for the interview.
Anytime.